Hello, everyone. Welcome to Democracy Tomorrow. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that probably has not been at the forefront of most people's minds at any point in their lives, but one that has fundamental importance when it comes to the question of world citizenship. And that is the ancient idea of having not just a national parliament to make political decisions of importance to a country, but a world parliament that would collectively make decisions of an international import on matters that affect the Earth as a whole, climate change, peace and security, the types of things that the UN Security Council is meant to be addressing, things of that nature. There are many different formulations that one can imagine about the shape and size of a world parliament, the scale, excuse me, the scale of its jurisdiction, um, who would be elected to it, who could participate on it, how frequently would it meet, and ultimately, where would it gain its political legitimacy from? There are thousands and thousands of questions that still need to be sorted out when it comes to this complex question. Of course, many countries, virtually all countries, have parliaments of one sort or another, in incredibly varying degrees of political legitimacy and democratic control. Some parliaments are not democratic whatsoever. They merely kowtow to the dictator in charge. Others are very democratic. Some parliaments are not necessarily country specific already. The European Parliament is the classic example in this case, where members of the European Union come together and vote on important cross-European issues. That's a democratically elected parliament, and we can talk in detail about that. But today we have with us a very special guest, Torbjörn Tännsjö from Sweden, who has written extensively on the question of world parliaments over many decades. He's a philosopher and a great thinker and a great writer. And so, Torbjörn, welcome to Democracy Tomorrow. And let me just ask the first question of the day. Is it really realistic that we can imagine a world that is governed entirely by a world parliament?
I think so, but I have changed my mind about how it would come about. The general idea is that we need a world state to sort out various global problems and to obviate existential threats, global existential threats. So it's really a world state that we need. And of course, we want it to be democratically ruled in some way. And then a world parliament is, I think, the natural idea of accomplishing global democracy, a global government elected in a way. I mean, here's one crucial question about the role of the government, and should there be a president, for example, for the world? That's a scaring idea, I think. So it's also important to go into what kind of democracy could be realized through a world parliament in a world state. Earlier, I thought that we should, in a piecemeal way, approach this global democracy by establishing a global some sort of a parliament, even though it had not very much power to start with, and eventually we would end up with a global democracy. Now I'm more pessimistic. I think we first had to have this global state, and then we could democratize it in a manner we have done with those democracies that exist in the world. None of these democracies have originated in a democratic Christian form, but they have eventually become democratic in rare places on the earth just now. 12% of the world population live in well-functioning liberal democracy today, only 12%.
So, how would we reach the idea of a global state, first and foremost, in a world where only 12% of nation states today are truly and fundamentally democratic, and also in a world, of course, which seems to be going very much in the opposite direction towards authoritarianism, despotism, nationalism, all of the things that were meant to be eradicated by the UN Charter in the end of the Second World War? How do we do it?
I have no idea, I must confess. I only have hopes here that somehow I think the global heating, the environmental crisis, especially in that it develops on a time scale, so it will become evident. It is perhaps already evident. It will become evident someday that unless we take action together, and we can only solve the problem by taking action together on a global scale. When we realize this, somehow some clever people, enlightened people will assume will find a way of establishing some sort of, I think, the enlightened despotism in the world, and then from then on we will start the project of democratizing this world. But of course, this might not happen, and then we will, I think, go under together. So the stakes are extremely high here, and you can have high hopes, but still be rather pessimistic about the outcome.
So your initial views when you started working on this issue were that it would be a long, slow, but endlessly evolutionary process that would ultimately end up in an ideal state, which was governed by an ideal world parliament in which the entire world participated. But now you've changed it a little bit to be because of your pessimism, essentially, and you think we have to get there much more quickly, or else we are all doomed. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
Your point
Yeah,
of view?
I still think, and that is controversial as well, that it is desirable in its own right to have this kind of global democracy. I mean, important philosophers like Immanuel Kant and John Rawls and Thomas Pogge and others have argued against the desirability of having this kind of rule. I think it's necessary to save us from disaster, but I also think that it is desirable still. But and something that is worth fighting for. And of course, it might sound scary to be even in an enlightened despotic world order. But then again, remember that only 12% today live in democracies. And hopefully those democracies can be kept also in another world order, where they are robbed of sovereignty, of course, but could rule on the level that where they are allowed to have a final say.
I mean, so, it's good that you raised the issue of sovereignty because, of course, that's the main argument against the idea of having a more unified global governance system. And everyone's afraid of losing their separate sovereignty simply because they've experienced, attacks and invasions and horrible treatment by others that they see throughout history. And so, that's an understandable point of view. But if we look at the current situation in the world, 88% of the planet, which is about 7 billion people or so, quite literally today in April 2025, do not have democratic rights to determine who governs them, who sets the laws, who sets the policies. And to me, that would be one of the strongest arguments in favor of a global parliament, is that it's a pathway by which we can facilitate the democratic participation of those who are not only unable to do so, but particularly those that are living under the power of despots and dictators and authoritarians and autocrats who now have virtually no pathways to exercise their political will, combined with the fact, of course, as you alluded to, that we simply cannot solve countless problems as 193 individual nation states. I mean, how can you possibly solve climate change unless we collaborate all together? How can you solve disarmament? How can you solve deforestation? How can you solve saving the oceans? How can you solve so many issues are simply impossible that affect everyone everywhere somehow? They must be satisfied. It must be, addressed at a global comprehensive level. And, yes, we have made political progress over time and we've, you know, added human rights to the lexicon of international law, and we've done all these positive things since the end of the Second World War, but we're still light years away from truly having a global parliament. And your answer before was probably totally correct. I don't know how to do it. I don't know either, but I certainly know, and I certainly believe, having traveled, far, very far and wide for a very long time, everywhere, that the number of people that I think would support the idea or the proposal of a world parliament because of what it could do to their individual lives is infinitely larger than most people realize. The people that argue the strongest in favor of sovereignty tend to be the ones that abuse that status and see sovereignty and use sovereignty as a wall against which to shield criticism for their abhorrent behavior against their very own citizens. That's, for the most part, how sovereignty is unfortunately bastardized as a concept. So, I think we need to throw out there ideas that can make the idea of a world parliament more and more realistic. And maybe something, I mean, I'll just throw one idea out here now, is that I believe if people had the possibility to express their wish, do you want to live in a world governed by international law that was the same, where you were treated equal to everyone else on the planet? Most people would go for that. And how do we get there? Well, maybe we get there by, we can't just get rid of nation states overnight, and that would be a foolish enterprise to try to do. But we need to do it in some slow, gradual, peaceful, above all else, nonviolent manner. Perhaps a loose alliance of pre-existing nation states that agreed to adhere to some new international legal framework that was governed by, ultimately, a world parliament comprised of international ministries instead of national ministries, and international civil servants instead of national civil servants, and voting rights for the entire world, not just the citizens of a nation state. And over time, probably very quickly, you'd have a very large number of nation states that adhered to that grouping, and that grouping could then form what ultimately would become an international world parliament, because it would be hopefully more successful than any national parliament could ever be. So that's one possible pathway, perhaps.
That's one possible
Yeah. What
way.
ones do you see as possible?
I mean, both less ambitious and more ambitious is, I mean, that we have an initiative today to have a parliamentary assembly established within the UN structure. And that sounds quite doable in a way. I mean, it doesn't mean any change of power of importance. It only means that it is somehow established to start with. And then the idea behind that initiative, of course, is to have it eventually elected by the world population. Not representing nation states, but really representing the world population. And so that I think would be nice to start with, regardless of whether we would be able to take the route you advise us to take, or whether it would have to be a more revolutionary manner that I set my hope in. But it might also be interesting already to speculate about what kind of democracy would suit the global order. I mean, we now are faced with, to simplify, with two radically different ideas about democracy. You have this American one, to simplify, where the people elect the president democratically. The president is, the majority can have its will, and apart from some details in the system, but roughly speaking, the majority could elect its president. Or you have this European and Australian parliamentary system with proportionate representative parliaments, which are not elected democratically. I mean, it serves a democratic purpose, but even candidates that are disliked by a majority can gain seats in the parliament. And that, I think, is and then the metaphor that the people rules itself through its parliament and legislates for itself through its parliament makes sense. Advocates of the other model, the more elitist model, Joseph Schumpeter and others, have argued that it makes no sense to speak of the will of the people and so forth. But I think it does, and this is a valuable metaphor. And so here we have simple choice between roughly two systems: the American one with the president of the world, which sounds, I think, scary, and then you have need all sorts of security measures, some that division of power and hurdles of all sorts that should keep this president innocuous. But we know that it doesn't work often. We fear that it will not work in the US today. We have seen that it didn't work in South America, where the system was important. So I think that is one important thing to keep in mind, that the kind of democracy we should advocate should be the indirect one, the proportionate one, where two of the main arguments against democracy are taken care of. One from Plato, the elitist one, that ordinary people can't rule themselves. No, we can't. Or we don't want to. We don't want to spend so much time on this. So, but then our representatives rule for us. And the other one, that the majority might come to suppress minorities, the Aristotelian objection to democracy, has the best kind of answer that you could find in this marvelous institution where people who are disliked by a majority can gain seats and advocate for their sake in the parliament. So I think when we advocate global democracy, it should be in this European, Scandinavian, Australian form with proportionate representation, indirect representation, where it's possible to get rid of the prime minister at any time when the parliament is fed up with him and her. And it is dangerous. The very idea is scary of having a world president who could also be our emperor eventually. And such a system could easily become, as Kant fears, a soulless despotism. You sink back into soulless despotism, even if you have established global democracy. I think the best idea here is to advocate, I have called this a populist idea of democracy, but that is perhaps a bit misleading. But it is exactly this representative, indirect representative system, granting seats to disliked minorities.
Absolutely. And so if there was a world parliament, just to explain it as graphically as we can to people, I mean, it would have to have a certain number of representatives, right? And so I mean, one could imagine any possible number of scenarios. I mean, whatever, the US Congress has 435 plus 100 senators, and Australia has 150, and I don't remember how many Sweden has, but about 100, I guess. How many members of parliament do you have?
349, if
Oh, 349. Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So, it's usually in the hundreds. But how, that would be difficult to do with a world parliament, because, each one of those representatives would ultimately have to represent, tens of millions of people. So we were toying around with the idea the other day of an 8,000 person global parliament. And basically each representative would have responsibility for representing the interests of 1 million people, right? So 1 million times 8,000 equals the 8 billion that we have today. So that's one possible scenario. It's clear, it's easy, understandable.
Let me just break in. I resent this idea of representing a number of people.
Okay.
I think the very idea of this kind of parliament is that you have representatives of ideas, of political ideas, that you have world parties and so. And then it isn't such a big deal that well, if you have 1,000 then you could think just one from Sweden, and many countries none. But they are not representatives of nations. They are not representatives even of groups of people. They should be representatives of ideas that gain support all over the globe. So what is presupposed here is a global political culture and discussion, global parties, really. Otherwise, it won't work, I think. But then this isn't such a big deal. I mean, then most of them will come from Asia, I think. But they will represent ideas that I can vote for or against as a Swede.
Right. And I mean, when you look at the de facto reality of the world, I mean, 70+% of the planet's population today is effectively poor. One paycheck away from oblivion. And another huge proportion of the planet is involved in a war right now, in an armed conflict. Everyone, all 8 billion of us, are affected by climate change already in one way or another. It's just a matter of scale, degree, and timing. So, we have not created, the paradise on earth that we could, had we different political methodologies and ideologies that were in place. But how do we, I think part of the problem, of course, with contemporary politics is the mindset of many of the leaders of these countries, and the particular psychology and pathology, in fact, of many. Because with the nation state, it's almost a system that guarantees that the most charismatic, the most power hungry, the most sociopathic in certain ways, or really psychologically unstable type people are the ones that are going to try the hardest to make it to the top and get as much power as they can. How do we guard against not only a global emperor scenario, which is the worst possible scenario, and one that is the main argument that people use about their opposition to a world parliament. We would, it's bad enough to have an individual dictator. We don't want one dictating to everybody. And I think there are ways of dealing with that, presuming we even need to have a head of state as such. And if we do, it has to be a multi-person rotating system, like in the European Union or in Switzerland, or as Uruguay tried, and many places have done it with a rotating
And that is, I
arrangement.
mean, if you look at Sweden, you can see that this is not a big deal at all. We have a king who has no political power whatsoever.
Right.
Do we really need a president? Do we really need a representative of the state as such? I doubt that. And I think it's dangerous in particular, it's dangerous to have this person elected by people for 4 years or something like that, the American way. It's better that this is just a person who has a symbolic, in that case, role. That's a way of staying clear of that kind of risk, I think.
Well, I guess almost every institution in the world has some form of leadership. Even though I personally don't like it, there is something about the human condition that says there has to be somebody who's the final decision maker in the event of a conflict. So how do we get around that issue? How do we get around that in the context of a global governance system?
That could be a prime minister, I think, an ordinary prime minister who could be displaced at any time.
Vote of no confidence, for instance.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, but you're also alluding to this psychological fact that I think it's a bit overemphasized here. I mean, why does the world look like it does today, with this fierce competition between nations, with this poor selection of leaders, with ruthless, psychopathic leaders even? Why does this happen? I think it is a structural problem, really. It has to do with the very fact that we are divided into sovereign nation states. And this is what has been called then the tragedy of the commons, that every leader is supposed to look at the best interest of his or her constituency. And then you end up in a situation where everyone is skilled at promoting those interests, but where the result for us all are devastating in these kinds of situations, to do with global warming, for example, or the nuclear weapons. And so we can't solve those problems when we keep what political theorists call the Westphalian system, with exactly with sovereign independent nation states. So it's really structural. This problem is structural. It's not psychological. Basically speaking. So if we just have a better political order, I think we could also expect better political leaders, where the legislation is really for all of us, not for each and any one of us, but for all of us together. Then I think we could also expect better leaders.
Well, I that's probably true, and leaders in many European countries and some other regions, it truly is public service that they're doing, and they see their lives as as giving to the public, and they're not out for personal gain, other than a little bit of adoration from time to time, but they're not out to milk the entire nation for billions of dollars, as many leaders in the world are. And many people enter politics in this day and age in all regions of the world exclusively to make money and to steal money and to act fraudulently and to get away with it, and even to commit horrible international crimes and whatever it may be. So, I mean, there's also something about the system which we continue to almost accept as a given, and it's been around since 1648 in various forms, but ultimately everything else in life has pretty much changed since 1648. Transport has changed, food has changed, whatever, water systems have changed, everything has changed, banking has changed, it's all changed, but not the nation state system that was established for many good reasons at that time, in that after that 30-year war, brutal war in Europe, and after all of the philosophical rants and raves of so many thinkers, it was an obvious outcome to organize ourselves with borders and nation states and so on. But now, I mean, I truly believe we must have reached the stage where collectively as a species, we're ready to go to the next level. And hopefully, my positive, optimistic take is all of the mess of 2025 is really the last dying gasps of the old order, with the lack of clarity as to what the new order will look like. And it's a little bit of a battle between ones that are truly global in orientation, who see all humans as equal, and those who are jumping inward to see their own type or their own kind or their own ethnic group or their own religion or their own nationality as somehow superior to all the rest. And that's obviously what we have to get beyond. And we need to start, seeing ourselves as humans first, and understand that we all share this planet. We were all born in the same place, and yet the fact that you and I were born in the Western world, at least I presume you were born in Sverige. I was born in the United States. Just by virtue of that, we were automatically 70 times richer than someone born in sub-Saharan Africa on the same day. Now, and that cannot be allowed to continue, So whatever form it takes, either we do it, or I fear, as you do, we will perish. And maybe just if we have just a few more minutes, but you dealt a lot with some pretty ghoulish questions in your book, From Despotism to Democracy: How a World Government Can Save Humanity, by Springer Press. You talked a lot about extinction and nuclear Armageddon and things of that nature. So can you just run through that for a second about the relationship between those ultimately bad outcomes and the need for a world parliament?
I think mainly it has to do with a simple decision problem. Again, the tragedy of the commons. I think that even nice politicians, if there are such thing, and I think there are some nice politicians in some democratic states, when they come together to solve problems like global heating, they fail. Even our Swedish representatives, for example, make all efforts they can to avoid carrying the burdens that are associated with the solution to these problems. So it has to do with this problem that by being successful in seeing to the interests they are set there to see to, they bring us together into disaster. I mean, think of war and peace. How did we establish peace within nation states? By establishing a monopoly on the use of violence in the state. We need to do something similar on the global scale. It is as simple as that, I think, and also, of course, as difficult as that, because the same mechanism that renders it impossible for us to solve the problems through negotiations between sovereign nation states also renders it extremely difficult to establish this global order this world state, this global, to have a world parliament really ruling the world. It is problem with coordination, really. It's not a problem with bad psychology, with our human nature or anything like that. It's a matter of coordination. And that's also why I put my hope eventually in some kind of coup, some sort of Deus ex machina, where people who can coordinate their actions can really solve the problem, and then from then on we can work for democracy, I think. But the problem is really a structural one, a decision theoretical problem, simple but nasty.
So can you just explain what you mean by a coup?
Again, I just hope that people who are situated in strategically important positions can see that we are really just at the precipice. We need to take action of some sort, and they will manage to do that together. I mean, such things have happened in sorry, my wife just to be at the office, but such things have happened many times in history on a more local scale. It could also, I think, happen on a global scale. It would take support, of course, some tacit support from the big nations like China and the United States. But I hope there is also in those states some concern really for our common existence on this globe.
If we had a world parliament, it would need to be based on some agreed law or rules, right?
Yes.
So what would that be? Would there be a world constitution, or could we simply use the Universal Declaration on Human Rights for starters and then develop a constitution? Or what would you propose? The UN Charter? What would you propose?
We would need a constitution, of course, written or unwritten. I mean, do the UK have a do they have a constitution? Well, I think they have, but it's not written.
That's right. Yeah.
It's better to have it spelled out, I think, in clear terms, so that we really could organize our global democracy around it and have it under the laws, so to speak, the democracy under the laws. So we would need a world constitution. So that would be one of the important tasks to set oneself when you live under some sort of global despotism, saved at the last minute from nuclear disaster, global heating. And there are also, of course, other threats to do with artificial intelligence and so that many people are concerned with today.
Well, maybe the UN Charter will turn 80 years of age on the 26th of June, in just 2 months' time. So maybe that's a good time for the world to reflect and come together and of course, preserve the good and positive forward-looking elements of the charter, but also to begin to start seeing it as a stepping stone and not an end in and of itself. And perhaps recent political developments in a certain country that everybody's thinking about these days and everywhere else can use this time not to be fearful and afraid, but to come together and unify in a way that was perhaps not as necessary 3 months ago as it is today. And through that unification, we can come together and start discussing and finding new common principles that we can build upon. And maybe the dream, so far, history's impossible dream of a world parliament will come true in our lifetimes. Let's hope so. Torbjörn Tännsjö, thank you so much. And you're speaking to us today from Stockholm, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I hope we can have you back on the channel sometime soon.
Okay. Thank you. Very nice being here. Thank you for having me.
All right. Take care, Torbjörn. We'll see you soon.